13. Beloved in the faith. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 to 4. Having these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Receive us. We have wronged no man. We have corrupted no man. We have defrauded no man. I speak not this to condemn you, for I have said before that ye are in our hearts, to die and live with you. Great is my boldness of speech toward you. Great is my glorying of you. I am filled with comfort. I am exceedingly joyful in all our tribulation. Up to this point in Paul's letter, the sins of the many Corinthians are very much in evidence, as are Paul's condemnation of them. At times he lumps all of them together, the good and the bad. The good, by not openly condemning the bad, share in their sins. This is a strange passage. Paul uses a surprising word here, one we would find it difficult to use. He calls the Corinthians beloved. In the very first verse, dearly beloved, in fact. Now, would you be ready to call a group of people beloved who had slandered you, who had defamed you, who had made out as though you were a scoundrel, an enemy of Christ, rather than his faithful servants? Nowhere was Paul more evilly treated than in Corinth, and yet he calls them dearly beloved. Paul is not the gushy type of person by any means. He only uses the word beloved 7 times in all his letters. See 2 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1 and chapter 12 verse 19, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 14 and chapter 15 verse 58, Romans chapter 12 verse 19, and Philippians chapter 12 verse 12 and chapter 4 verse 1. The strange part is that in 4 of these 7 times it appears in his letter to the Corinthians. Obviously, we're up against something here that is quite remarkable. Paul was a man of intense feelings, strongly for or against anything. He is clearly very strongly against the sins of the Corinthians. He goes after them as he does no one else. And yet, 4 of the 7 times that he uses the word beloved in all his writings, he uses it of the Corinthians, calling them dearly beloved. What is the reason for that? There has to be some kind of identification by Paul to himself with the Corinthians. Paul's messianic faith had very early interested him in Jesus, and it led to his very hostile position. Paul calls himself the chief of sinners. He had, when Christ was alive, been against him and persecuted those who were his saints, being ready to cast a vote of death for Stephen. He had obtained a legal warrant to persecute, arrest, and try and condemn Christians. After his conversion, Paul had an intense hostility to the enemies of Christ, as well as an understanding of their problems. His criticism was sharp, but his understanding very real. We know that Paul always felt deeply grieved over what he had done earlier. Why does he feel so close to the Corinthians of all people? What Paul says is understandable if we realize that, in having been on the other side, he could appreciate the feelings of those who were on the other side. Paul knew how he would have felt about someone like himself had not the grace of God converted him. If Paul were still Saul, the ungodly, he would have gone after Paul hammer and tongs. Paul understands the sinner, understands his hostility to Christ and the faith. So, when he encounters this hostility in the church, in those who are imperfectly converted, or not converted at all, even though his plain speaking is very obvious, so too is his concern for them. It is hard to imagine anyone else having gone to Corinth and having reacted as Paul did, having shown the patience that he did, and having called them 4 times dearly beloved. This is why the letters to the Corinthians are such sad ones. The grief is so real because Paul's hurt is accordingly real. He tells them, "You converts have a duty to cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God." Verse 1. Paul does not say yourselves, but ourselves. This duty is very real to Paul, and he wants it to be real to all. He identifies himself with them to the point where he says not cleanse yourselves, but ourselves. Perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Receive us. Verses 1 and 2. The plea is tremendous. It is Paul crying out, receive us. We have wronged no man. We have corrupted no man. We have defrauded no man. He thus says, open your hearts to us. We wronged no man. We corrupted no man. We took advantage of no man. Early in the life of the faith, false leaders appeared who took advantage of believers in many ways. It was often harder then than now to see the evil of these men because Christians, as at the best hated outsiders, assumed that all in their ranks assumed this position with a hated minority out of faith. This was not necessarily true. Paul makes clear his innocence. He had neither wronged, nor corrupted, nor taken advantage of any man. Who can say in all of Corinth, in the church or out of the church, that Paul defrauded, corrupted, or wronged any one of them? Paul appeals to these people, receive me. In verse 3 he adds, I speak not this to condemn you, for I have said before that ye are in our hearts to die and live with you. This was for them to do in their own hearts. Paul says in the faith that we are and must be together, not at odds. It is love, not anger nor hurt, that governs him. He loves them in spite of their sins and wants them to love him also. His rebukes to the Corinthians have as their purpose to re-establish a close bond of faith and love. So Paul is appealing to them. Ye are in our hearts to die and live with you. Verse 3. Paul feels that strongly about them. Some of us, at one time or another, felt deeply the hurt or the grief that comes when we are betrayed, when we are wronged or hurt by someone who should be grateful. We can then begin to understand Paul. Paul had made clear to them, you are sinners, but I who speak to you was a sinner, and not just an ordinary sinner. I sinned against the Christ in person. I persecuted and was responsible for the death of some of his greatest saints. He tells us he cast his vote against Stephen, and Stephen died. Great is my boldness of speech toward you. Great is my glorying of you. I am filled with comfort. I am exceedingly joyful in all our tribulation. Verse 4. An amazing statement. Paul is saying, what you are doing is wrong, and I am suffering for it. And even though I am suffering, I am exceedingly joyful because, in the process, I am recognizing that the Lord saves others like myself, and they understand your sin because it was my sin. You were sinning against an apostle. I sinned against the Christ. This is why I am so bold and open and frank in all that I have to say. This is why I praise and glory in you in spite of all your sins and problems. This is why, in spite of my hurt, I am filled with comfort. Because, although you are sinning Christians, you're Christians in some sense. Paul's boldness of speech towards the Corinthians rests on his love of them. In fact, he adds, great is my glorying of you. This seems to be hardly likely to be true, unless we remember that Paul had first gone to Corinth in some fear and trembling because of the evil reputation of Corinth. Thus, given their sins, he was also mindful of their courage and faith. This gave him a basic hopefulness and confidence in them. It also led him to glory in their behalf and to find comfort in the face of everything. In fact, Paul says, I am filled with comfort. I am exceedingly joyful in all our tribulation. Verse 4. Thus, the Corinthians, in their persistence in the faith, were a source of strength to Paul. It is for this reason that, more than all other churches, the Corinthians were beloved to Paul. They were, in a particular way, his children in the faith, and hence beloved. Paul's patience commends patience to us. We don't have as ugly a situation as he does. We are misunderstood. Often we are hurt. We feel that this or that group of Christians, as far as we are concerned, has to be written off. The patience of Paul and his abiding love, his ability to call them dearly beloved, is, I think, one of the most moving aspects of 2 Corinthians.